Hello and welcome to Modernist Mixing. In this video I want to show you my mix template. So this mix template was based on Billy Decker's speed mixing template. You can buy the book off Amazon, it's amazing. And the reason Billy did this was that he was spending too much time building up mixes from scratch. And so what he did is he set up a basic template and he just imports the tracks in, and the tracks already have most of the effects that he's likely to use with some EQ settings. And he basically turns them on or just modifies them as needed, which saves him a lot of time. Now this is a great idea. I've taken that and I adapted it to myself. And what I have now is my mixing template that I've been building and updating as necessary over the past year. So what we have is I have the drum tracks. So I have two kick tracks. They're exactly the same. What I have on the inserts is, first of all, I have an aligner. What this is it's similar to Sound Radic's Auto Align. It's from Melda. I like the interface a bit better, to be frank. And this, what it does is, you know, with drum kits, there are multiple mics and they're picking up the same instruments. When the drummer hits the snare, for example, the microphone of the snare picks up the signal, the transient, a bit early from the microphone that's on the overhead. So basically what this does is it analyzes the phase relationship between all of the drum tracks, and then it sets up a delay between these tracks so that the most cohesive phase relationship is available to the mixer. So what I like to do is when I get live drums, especially, not with program drums, but live drums, I make sure that I run Auto Align, let it analyze it, and see if there's any kind of phase problems that needs fixing. Sometimes the difference is subtle, but sometimes it gives you a nice bottom end, especially on the snare. So my next plugin is the drum gate. What this does is it's the most intelligent and most perfect drum gate I have ever used. It will let you isolate the kick, the snare, the toms, etc., get rid of any cymbal bleed, and give you a nice, clean, even sample-like result. After that, I have a basic EQ, which is, as you see, roughly what I would do with any kick. I would lightly boost the low end around 50 Hertz and get rid of some of the mud around 160, some of the mud around 500, and then add a little clickiness around 5K. So this is a starting point. When I turn this on, it will make it a tiny bit better, but I'll probably boost these a bit more, or maybe cut this a bit more, maybe cut this like that. I don't know, it depends on what I receive. After that, I have a transient designer. I don't really like compression on drums. I like to add compression as a parallel compressor. But what I like is a transient designer, which will get rid of some of the sustain of the drum shells and then increase some of the attack. This is basically a specially set up compressor, but it only attacks the transient part, so I really like it. So after that, I have the clipper. Now this is usually for me to increase the gain. So I increase the gain and let it clip a few dBs. And I usually use the wet and dry control and make sure that the clipper is not distorting too much. The Kazrock K-Clip 3 allows you to have online and offline oversampling. So at the moment I have the online oversampling at 4x, meaning that if I'm working at 48 kilohertz, it will multiply it to 192 kilohertz, which will get rid of most of the alias and distortion. Offline, meaning the amount of oversampling it will employ during export is twice of that. So that's 384 kilohertz. So that's pretty clean, obviously. I have the exact same kick channel as the second track. What happens is sometimes you get the inside kick and the outside kick, or maybe a sub kick, so I add those. I have the trigger track. What this is, it just has slate trigger on it. And I have several samples that I've collected over the years. Mostly I use the Get Good Drums triggers, or I have Billy Decker's own drum shots, which are quite good. Obviously the slate trigger is also great as well. I like to experiment. It depends on what the song needs. If it's like a rock song, it will need like a higher frequency kick. If not, I'll get a more subby 808-like kick. Okay, let's move on to the snare. Now on the snare, again, I have the Auto Align, and I have the drum gate, and I have the EQ. So the EQ is basically getting rid of the low end with a shelf. And then I boost the 200 Hertz area a bit. And then right above that, I do a dip. You can think of this as the Pultec trick, but on a smaller scale. And I add some bite around 8K. And then I have the Transient Designer. This time I increase the sustain a bit because we all love huge snares. And after that I have the Clipper. And then I have a short reverb, which is something I might add. And in case I do, I switch this track from mono to stereo. I need to hear that the snare has a bit more body, a bit more width. And this short reverb, around 30%, adds that width. Kind of fattens up the snare a bit. Second snare is almost the same, no reverb. I usually use this for the bottom microphone. I have the trigger, again, slate trigger, clipper, and then an EQ. The EQ is flat. Then we move on to the toms. Again, the aligner, the drum gate, a fab filter, Pro Q. This kind of mimics the kick, but instead of boosting around 50 Hz, I'm boosting around 100 Hz. And then the Transient Designer, and then the Clipper. Tom 2, Tom 3, they're all the same, but I pan them as a drum kit from the drummer's perspective. Then the hats, again, aligner, EQ, gets rid of the lows, adds some sizzle, and then the Clipper. I have two overhead tracks, overhead left and right, and I also have a stereo overhead track. So if the tracks I receive are mono, the overheads are mono, left and right, I just copy them onto these two tracks and get rid of the stereo track. If they're stereo, I copy them over to the stereo track and then get rid of the left and right mono tracks. So basically, this is the EQ, gets rid of the low end and then adds a little sizzle, and then a Clipper to increase the volume. Got the room mic. This is the overhead channel duplicated, but I get rid of some of the sizzle at the higher end of the track. Again, ends with the Clipper. And the percussion tracks, these are generic like shakers, tambourine, whatever you might add. They get rid of the lower ends, get rid of the mids a bit, and then add a little of high end. Next comes the bass. Now what I do is I treat the bass in 3 tracks. Basically I have the lows, the mids, and the highs. The lows, what I do is I copy the single bass performance into 3 tracks, just duplicated, triplicated basically. Now the first track, the lows, gets rid of all of the high end, filters them out, and then I compress it with the opto style, which is similar to LA2A. I reduce the threshold as needed, so I get maybe 2-3 decibels of compression all around. And afterwards I limit it, so I get about maybe 1 or 2 decibels of limiting. And I might play with the style. It's set to punchy normally, but I might move it to transparent if it's creating a lot of harmonics. And after that, I have the ducker. Now what this is a volume envelope shaper, but it's side chained. You can see the side chain here to the kick track. So whenever the kick hits, the bass is ducking out of the way, allowing the kick to go through. Afterwards, the bass tonal bass parts come through. This only is set on the low bass track. So the mids is first band limited. So what I do is I get rid of the lows, I get rid of the highs, only the mid frequencies. And then I add a distortion. This might be the Dark Glass Ultra distortion pedal emulation from Neural DSP, or it might be the Devil Lock. Depends on the song, depends on the bass part. I like to experiment with these. And then the highs, same deal, but this time it gets rid of the low and the mids, leaves only the highs. And then I have 2 chorus plugins on this. One of these is the Space Modulator set to the symphonic mode, which is apparently a modeling of the Yamaha SPX rack unit, which has a very famous chorus mode called the Symphony. And the second one is a Juno chorus. Both of these plugins are free. You can download them off their websites. So basically this will give a nice width to the bass, but only on the higher frequencies. Moving on to the electric guitars. Pretty simple. I filter out the lows, I filter out the high-end fizz. This will usually move towards the left, so it depends on how much fizz I have on the guitar amps. And if this doesn't kind of work to get rid of all of the nastiness, I add a cab emulation. Well, not an emulation, but an impulse response. This is Get Good Drums Cali Oversized. This is basically an impulse response player, and it has a nice interface. You can select from different impulse responses. You can add your own if you want to, and then you can select different microphones. So basically, you select one cab, and then that cab has several microphones impulse response, so you know which one the ribbon is, etc. So if it's too fizzy, you can go with a smooth cab with a Roya ribbon mic, or maybe a large diaphragm microphone, etc. And you can mix and match, obviously. So what this does is, if the guitar tone is too fizzy, is too harsh, what this does, it kind of applies its own filter, gets rid of all of the nasty stuff, and then what's left is usually, most of the time, like 90% there, of a really nice mic'd up guitar amp. And this is copied all through the guitar tracks. These are all the same. These two are for DI tracks. So what I have here is, again, the EQ, same EQ, and then the archetype Nolly, which is also from Neural DSP. This is a nice guitar amp emulation plugin. It has 4 modes, depends on how heavy you need to get, but usually having the clean tone and then adding maybe the overdrive gives you a nice light rock sound. And obviously if you need heavier guitar tones, that's also available. Onto the acoustics, I have a nice saturator for the upper end of the harmonics. As you see, I've split this into 2 bands, which is around 250. So the low end has no saturation, but the higher end has a bit of a gentle saturation algorithm. And the drive is about 50%, with the dynamics moved to the right a bit. So this dynamics allows you to select between transient program material and more tonal transient material. So it's moved to the right a bit. And basically I will add this in and play with the mix knob and see how well it fills up the mid and upper range of the acoustic guitars. Afterwards I have an EQ, which is quite basic, gets rid of the mud, gets rid of maybe the 2K harshness, and then adds a bit of top end. This will probably move towards the right, depends on how the acoustic guitars were arranged in the song. Basically, if it was just strumming, or if it's not, like a background roll, this will probably move towards the right, maybe to 200, 300, depends on the recording, obviously. It's slightly compressed afterwards with a classic compressor, maybe 2-3 decibels at most, and then limited just in case. Same with the right track, same with the mid track. Afterwards comes the keys. Now, keys is anything that is not guitars, not percussion, not bass. Basically, like reed instruments, strings, synthesizers, pianos, anything that is not one of the others goes into this bucket. So what I have is, again, the saturator, which is quite similar to the acoustic guitar. And then afterwards, I have some very basic EQ. Obviously, as I don't know what I'll be dumping into this bucket, I have a low pass and I'll get rid of the 300 mids a bit. And then it depends on basically what the instrument is. I mean, it might end up like this, for all I know. Afterwards, I go to the main vocals. Now, this is pretty simple as well. This is almost exactly how Billy sets it up. So I get a low pass filter, which will probably move depending on if it's a female singer, if it's a male singer, or in which register they're playing. So I get rid of any of the notes they're not singing, actually. And then I get rid of the low end hump around 150, 160, and then I add some sheen around 15K. So this is obviously pretty like start me up kind of EQ. It will get rid of any low-end rumble, but I'll obviously have to dial in an EQ, which suits the vocal performance a bit better. I have a tiny bit of compression here. It will only compress around maybe 2-3 decibels at most. Now, the style is vocal, and this goes into a bus, which also has an LA2A compressor in it, which I'll show in a minute. I have a de-esser, which will lightly de-ess. If this is working too hard, I usually go in and edit the S's manually out. Now, what I have as a sends is the plate, the 8th delay, and the slap delay. Basically, I turn these on and see how they sit within the mix. I have doubles. It's the same, almost the same as the main vocal tracks, but what I have is I get rid of the higher end as well. So I don't need all of the consonants in the backing vocals or the doubles where the S's and the H's and the T's, etc. are stacking up. I only want the main vocal to provide the intelligibility, and I want the backing vocals to provide all of the tonal backups. I'll take you to my effects section. Now, these purple tracks are all my effects. What I have is a drum ambience track. It's a shortish 1-second delay, and it's from the Bricasti M7 library, which comes with the Reverberate 3. And this is an ambience reverb, which gives the drums a nice little cohesive, we were tracked in the same space kind of feel. And then I have an EQ. This depends on the track, obviously, but I'll probably get rid of the low end. I'll probably get rid of the mid-range, depends on the track. By the way, my reverbs are always set up so it will have some kind of EQ on it as well. Moving on, this is the parallel drum track. It has the UAD distressor emulation on it. I set it to the nuke setting, the nuke ratio, and it has the high pass filter both for the detector and the audio. And what I do is I let this slam the drums and I feed this in as needed. I also have a distortion track set for the drums. So basically this is again Saturn 2. I have set the dynamics to a more transient style. This is actually the console crush setting, and when you feed the drum shells into this, it will give you a nice grit, it will give you a nice attack, more bite to the drum shells. The dark plate is the reverb, which is again a Bricasti M7 impulse response. It's kind of dark in tone, and you'll see that I filter out anything above 5K and get rid of the low end. And this is usually my reverb for the instrument tracks. So guitars, keys, anything that goes into reverb goes into this reverb. For the vocal reverb, I have a kind of a brighter setting. It's the CD plate A. It's kind of a more hi-fi, a bit more. It will accentuate the S's and the T's, etc. when the vocal sings. So it's more geared towards a vocal reverb, in my opinion. And what I do is I will change the decay of the impulse response. It has a clever way of recalculating the length of the reverbs. I might shorten this, I might make it longer, so it depends on the song, obviously. I also have an EQ going in, and I also have an EQ afterwards, which will let me filter out if I have any annoying frequencies coming in. Again, vocal parallel compression. This is set to the opto, not the nuke. And the opto will allow the vocal to have a nice smooth leveling going through it. I just want to get the main vocal through this and feed it towards the main vocal tracks, so it gives it a nice little body boost. Then the slap delay comes afterwards. This is a preset from the CLA-ish tape slap. The spread I'll decide based on the track. So if it's a sparse track, I might have a more spread out slap delay. If it's more like a busy kind of arrangement, I might switch that to mono. I don't want to give it too much width. Afterwards, I have the 8th delay, again same repeater. It's basically a 8th tape classic delay setting. It's synced to the tempo of the song, obviously, and then spread a bit. And I add a little bit of color here, which I think it gives it like a nice high mid kind of. It sticks out more basically when you move this color to the right. And again, I have a decapitator, which is something that I use if the vocals are not cutting through enough. So I get rid of the low ends and I push the tone a bit, and maybe I might get rid of the fizz as well. But if you drive this enough and you feed it underneath the vocals, it will allow you, especially in rock songs, it will allow you to get the vocals through with busy guitars. Let's come to my buses. So basically anything that's drums, anything that's percussion, transients, etc. goes into the drum bus. What I have is a multiband saturator. This does not get turned on all the time. I might just add it maybe like 20%, depends on the song. An empty EQ. So when the drum track is playing together, I might find that there's some build up around the mids, so it's just easier to get rid of that here. And then I have the clipper. So this will allow me to maybe clip another couple of dBs, which will allow me to have more volume at the end of the mix. And so I can limit less, but still get a nice loud master. The bass. So this is an empty EQ. Again, bass lane, this is quite new, maybe a couple of months old. It's the free version. It allows you to dial in the width of the chorus of the bass, basically. So I might find that it's a bit too wide, and I just might play with this and see if it's behaving a bit better that way. And the limiter. This will depend, how I set this will depend on the volume of the bass. So I might just lower the threshold to get the bass a bit more volume. And if it's a bit too dynamic, I might lower the ceiling down, so it is actually limiting at this stage as well. Like I said, it depends on the mix. I move on to the music bus, which is all my guitars, all my keys, acoustics, etc. Anything that's not bass, drums or vocals goes through here. So empty EQ. I also have a limiter at the end. I might use this to limit maybe the peaks if it's too percussive, if it's producing a lot of stray peaks. And if not, I might just use this as a volume boost if it needs any. Afterwards, I have track spacer. This is sidechained to the vocal, so whenever the vocal sings, this dynamic EQ, I guess, allows me to duck only the frequencies where the vocal is singing. So if the vocal is screaming, right, at maybe 1, 2K, it will only duck that part. If it's singing something low in low registers, it will duck that part. So basically it applies a 2-3 decibel volume cut only on those frequencies that allows the vocals to push a bit more over the music. But whenever the vocal is not singing, it allows the full orchestra to come through. After that, I have the backing vox bus, empty EQ, limiting, soothe 2. So basically this is again I guess this is also a dynamic EQ, but it lets you select which frequencies you want it to work harder. So I wanted to work harder around the 4K and the muddy 300K areas. Again, depends on the song. I might move this around a bit, but this is usually where it stays, and maybe I might add around 8K if it has too much S's and T's and etc. So this is the backing vocal bus. Moving on to the vocal bus, I have the LA2A emulation here. It will probably reduce around maybe 1-2 decibels at most when the vocals are, you know, at the end of the song where they're shouting and everything. It just is there to add some more harmonics, some more tube emulation warmth to it, and it usually acts as a main volume slider in case this has to move a bit too much. So I like to keep my fader around 0 where it's most sensitive to changes. So I use the gain on this to change the level of the vocals so it sits nicely, and I can only do like small changes if I need to do any automation. After that, I have another instance of soothe, which also does the same job as it does in the backing vocals. And all these bus tracks go into my mix bus. So what I have on my mix bus is a mix tool, which allows me to change the gain coming into my mix bus processing. So if it's coming in too hot, I just lower this a bit. If it's coming in too low, I just increase it a bit. Basically, most of the time, like 90%, I will have to lower this maybe 5-6 decibels. So the next plugin in line, which is the SSL bus compressor, is sitting at a healthy level where needle is basically only responding to the snares and maybe for 2 or 3 decibels at most. Now the attack, I usually decide this based on the tempo of the song. If it's a fast tempo song, I usually go with the fastest attack. If it's a slower song, I might turn this up a bit and let the transient go through a bit more. And I have the side chain filter around 100 Hz. I guess this is 100 Hz, I don't know, doesn't say. Anyways, this is something that I turn on towards the end of the mix and see if it improves things. So it might stay off if it's squishing things down a bit. But most of the time, like 80% of the time, I turn it on, it just compresses 2 or 3 decibels from the snare, from maybe the highest peaks, and then I find it that it glues the thing a bit together. Afterwards, there's a tape emulation, which is from Softtube. I usually like to use the B setting, which gives a bit of a low-end bump, and then I might, depending on how tired my ears are, I might have pushed the trebles a bit too far. So this has a nice high frequency trim knob here, which I might just lower down a bit. So it gets rid of all the fizz, all of the higher end, harshness. And as I primarily work on headphones, by the time I get to this stage, it's like been an hour and my ears might have gotten a bit tired. So I might have pushed the trebles a bit further than necessary. So this will allow me to dial up down a bit. After the tape emulation, I have Kelvin Tone Shaper. Now, what this does, it's basically giving you different models of saturation. So I haven't really gone deep dive into this. I don't know how the harmonics compare from purple to dark iron, etc. But basically, I went with the descriptions underneath it. And I love the purple going to the boutique. So what this does is, purple is the first stage and boutique is the second stage. So if I drive this, it's actually causing the second stage to saturate more. So I only add a little bit on each stage, and I might use these shaping EQs, pre-shaping or post-shaping EQs, depending on the song. So what you can do is you can pre-boost some frequencies, causing them to saturate more on the saturation stage. So that depends on the song. I like to experiment and see how that works. What I like about this is that it has a nice spread function. This will allow it to give a bit more stereo width of the whole mix, but only on the higher end as I can hear it, not the whole thing. So it keeps the bass and the lower frequencies fairly in the center, but it expands, it spreads out the higher frequencies quite nicely. After that, I have my master bus. So basically, these are the plugins that I will use if I'm not going to master the track. But if I'm going to master the track myself, basically if I'm going to bring it to a level which will be sent out to distribution platforms or whatever, I will engage this master bus plugins. So what I aim to do is to get as close to possible to a finished job on my mix bus, and I wouldn't have to rely on any kind of EQ or anything like that on the master bus. As you can see, there aren't any EQs or anything on my master bus or my mix bus basically. So what I have is Gullfoss Master. Gullfoss is kind of a stabilizer. It's an intelligent dynamic EQ plugin which wants to push certain peaks and valleys towards a predetermined tonal balance. So when I play this mix, I'm expecting for it to not work more than maybe 1-2 decibels at any of the frequency ranges. So if I see that it's maybe working too much around the 150 range, if it's pushing it too much like towards 5-6 decibels below zero, then I understand that my low end is kind of messed up. I need to go back and fix whatever is causing those peaks. So I kind of use it as a verification process. So if it's like moving gently, if it's just responding to like certain attacks or maybe certain like crescendos, maybe I'm all good. If it's only smoothly sailing throughout the song, I know it's a balanced mix. After that, I have Dyn1 3. So what Dyn1 does, it's a 5-band parallel processor. It will compress the band individually and let you feed it back into the mix, which gives you a nice lift. And it's kind of a low-level compressor, if you like, similar to Wave's MV2, Max Volume 2. And it lets you do that in a multi-band way. It's really nice. It will really help if you want a thick, dense mix, and I might use this or not use it depending on the track, but it's nice to have. And I kind of might swap this for the Oxford Inflator from time to time, but this is my first go-to. Afterwards, I have a K-clip. I want to make sure I have a couple of dBs clipping maybe on the snare, so I get a bit more headroom when I get to my final limiter. So my final limiter is DMG Audio's Limitless, and Limitless is a multi-band limiter. It will allow you to change styles from aggressive to punchy to warm, smooth quite easily, and you don't have to go through all of these manual settings. And what you can do is you can also use the clipper on this if you want a bit more, crunchy volume out of it. But I find that the K-clip gets rid of all of the transients that I want to get rid of quite cleanly, quite transparently, so I never had to use this in a mix. You just lower the threshold and get to the volume target that you want to. Speaking of targets, here is my trusted New Gen Audio Master Check. So basically this is how I check my LUFS, the loudness measurement. What I do is I tend to mix quite loud, and it's not uncommon for me to see that I'm working at maybe 5 LUFS despite even not turning on the master limiter. So I push the mix, and if I find it's too hot, I just dial it down with the mix tool. After that, I have the tonal balance control. This is just another verification, making sure that my tired ears are not pushing the bass or the trebles too high. Usually I like to see the mix within these green regions, and this is not a must. I mean, if it sounds good, it sounds good, but sometimes you get tired and you don't realize that you're pushing the higher end a bit too much, so it starts to show up around here as noise. What I do is then I just add an EQ and I get rid of the extreme high end. So basically this is my mix template, and what I do is I download the tracks from the client, or if I'm going to do one of my own productions, I just export everything and I bring in all the tracks depending on where they belong. So if it's the kick, obviously I bring it into the kick track, and if it's toms, I bring in the toms track, etc. And by the time everything is in place and I turn on all the plugins, I should get maybe 50-60% of the way into the mix. So this allows me to not deal with any setup, any rerouting, any dragging in plugins and setting the defaults, etc. So basically this will allow me to get halfway there, and afterwards I can quickly go through all the tracks and make any necessary changes and get to the 90% done point maybe in an hour and a half. After that, I usually send it out to the client, get the feedback, make sure I'm not too far off from the target. This allows us to start working on the feedback, on the mix notes much more sooner, and gives us like a base start our discussions from. So this is the template that you'll be seeing on the videos that I'll be doing in my speed mixes. I hope this was valuable, and if you like this video, please subscribe and see you next time.